Tornati, riaprirei la seconda parte di questa mattinata e la nostra prima speaker è Đurđa Trajković dell'Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory, who is going to present a talk on madness of Pierre Menard, power and the untranslatable. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I wish to thank organizers for organizing this wonderful conference, and I have to make an exception and thank Professor Đurđa because he was talking about IMERA language. True heterogeneity begins with incompatibility, according to Antonio Correa, so thank you for bringing that in, so we can truly have something more than Eurocentric view. So the title of this talk is called Limits on of Translation, Stupidity of Pierre Menard, the Powerless Freedom of the Untranslatable. This exposition will have had three related themes. First, it will refer to the relation between translation and market. Since market is at the heart, market might be the heart of our present conjuncture. Then it will proceed to the problem around multiculturalism and identity politics, since cultural translation has mostly been framed around these two master concepts. And master concepts they are: brands circulating on market. Brett Levinson teaches in his book Market and Thought from 2001 how contemporary discourse is stupid for a reason. It takes all concepts, rhetoric, destruction, deconstruction, Europe, desire, philosophy, feminism, Marxist thinking, post-colonial theory, and converts them into brands. Politics emerges not as a set of actions and concepts, but a choice for this or that brand. And within that discourse, the turning to ideas, concepts, and language emerge as a choice, as buying in. Leaving aside now the fact that cultural is an ideological discourse, as Alberto Moreiras and Gayatri Spivak have shown, multiculturalism and identity politics are analogs to the problem of the market, hence related, but not inseparable from political and ideological problems and consequently language. Several possibilities emerge as a way to insist today on the untranslatable and its powerless freedom, no matter how fragile it is, and fragile it is. Finally, I will engage in reading of Jorge Luis Borges' famous text, Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote, and what does it have to do with desire for the untranslatable? Because it seems that one of the problems of today is that we have seemed to have forgotten or simply refused to engage with singularity. I'm completely aware that the problem of singularity is complicated, so I'm coming from Paul Deman in Rhetoric and Semiotics and Jacques Derrida in The Acts of Literature, who argue that singularity is that which cannot be translated or converted into a specific discourse. My argument is that the recent effort to revive cultural translation hinge on translatability assumption, no matter how difficult it might be, and cover over the untranslatable. My exposition does not wish to be exhaustive, but it does want to draw attention for further thinking we're facing today with the event of globalization and noisy neoliberalism, which is our common reality principle, common sense in Europe, but also everywhere else in the world, or what is left of it. Literature is crossed by culture, which is not the one and the same as to say that literature is exhausted by culture, as Gayatri Spivak would claim or argue in Death of Discipline, 2002. Literature exceeds culture only so because figures of strangers, queers, and alterities, tropes of testimonies and autographical fictions, that is, people without history and culture, those denied history and culture, those wronged by Western and European history of colonization and imperialism, inhabit it. In other words, literature as institution, as Jorge Luis Borges, Hispanist fabulist and thinker, taught us very well, always already trains otherwise through the aesthetic process and rhetoric, which in Latin America starts in 1492. No matter how brutal aesthetic education and literacy is, and brutal it is since humanism and Renaissance, without this, one would not be able to experience, encounter an event, and consequently engage and assume responsibility toward other, for one is never responsible enough. This is the lesson of Emmanuel Levinas. Although he was very critical of literariness, one has to be trailing us here. Literacy introduces modern politics as the disagreement among equals, equally written people. The violence that may ensue from such a disagreement does not result from struggle between civilization and barbarism, as it is usually thought, but according to Jacques Rancière, between distinct accords. Because it gives someone power and recognition, language does, for language interpolates because it is structured like unconscious. This is the lesson of Lacan, Althusser, and Butler. But it also marks tonality, rhythm, accent, pitch, the style, as well as nonsense, gibberish, gobble-gobble, James Joyce. That it is difficult to say what language is goes without saying. Language in itself does not exist. It is always already relation. It is both existential and social, but irreducible to those fields. No actual speech or writing can capture this pure language, as Walter Benjamin suggests. No single idiom rationally can account for the relation, the plurality, the heterogeneity of discourses. This, nonetheless, is the task of translator, according to Benjamin. The translator does not translate one language into another, but the relations of the many languages that mark and make every particular language into one, or one that itself turns out to be a relation to another. The relation of tongues, or language as such, by logical necessity exceeds its translation, which thereby always falls short of its object. However, this is also the argument of Barbara Cassin in her dictionary. However, literature in its treatment of the popular frequently serves as an instrument for neutralizing its alterity and rendering it fully legible, visible, and translatable. Brett Levinson calls this an overexposure that we're experiencing today as both as recognizable objects of aesthetic appreciation, ready for sociology to devour it and stamp it to value, high literature, low literature, good literature, bad literature, as a countable member of a social whole, in other words, dialectical inclusion-exclusion, or as psychoanalytical objects of reading our desires. Once alterity is counted, it assumes a place and property within the whole and becomes a subject ready to be fully represented, recognized, and consequently marketed. So this is the difficulty today of separating the whole. Populism, or modern politics, as Borges sees it, and he's very ungenerous, cannot not recall, for it contains in its essence the spirit of totalitarianism, manifest in Argentina in the form of dictatorship in the 70s and 80s, but also everywhere else in the world. Anxious and fearful to defend itself from the other via the index, the border, the barrier that opens the way to this other, that marked the other as marked from the start, but forgot about it, as a melancholic would do, happily it can be overcome, the state resorts to the erasure or eradication of the alter writing or alter being with others, for singularities are always already with others, sharing the common in heterogeneity and finitude, since the more civilized route, that of training, is already removed from its range of options. There is no outside of this today, seems to be the story and myth in Europe. This is the limit that Europe must disallow, forget, reject in order to be Europe. Be as it may, there is no possibility of event and revolution without aesthetics and literature. For event to be perceived as such, one must learn how to develop a sight. I apologize. So this is the limit that Europe must disavow, forget, reject in order to be Europe. Be it as it may, there is no possibility of event and revolution without aesthetics and literature. For event to be perceived as such, one must learn how to develop a sight for radios in the dark, obscure, and brutal times we live today. And this is the aporia of event. For event is something wholly other that catches me by surprise. And yet, if one did not prepare oneself to see it, one would not be able to be recognized as such. Thus, one becomes a subject whose will is to event. And even though language cannot express the will of the subject, there is a gap between the two. Not every will is will to power. The event reveals itself, if it ever does, through hyperbolic doubt and through querer decir, wanting to say, sense and desire. But one cannot say it, since it is debatable today even if we have speech outside the market. Because as soon as one says it, one ruins it, dates it, the event itself. In other words, events are affective, fatigued, obsessive, persecutive, not entirely rational. Something happens to language, to a reader, and a text. But it also interrupts our habitual ways of thinking, acting, and doing, or it should be, because if it didn't, it's not an event. And this is learning to read and hear each other. This is otherwise the legacy of the thought of Borges, Derrida, and Levinas, but not only them. Borges' reflection on aesthetics shared the structure of event, arguing that the aesthetic act does not reside in the quality of work, but in reading, commerce between text and reader, a reciprocal doing in which reader and language act upon and affect one another, a mutual affection that works through image, figure, and rhythm. The aesthetic registers a thrill as something that affects body, a tremor or shudder associated with sudden and unexpected pleasure, which bears witness within repetition that is reading to an encounter with something unexpected and perhaps unrepeatable. The aesthetic act for Borges is thus irreducible to theoretical conceptualization, and it happens at the limits of subject. Borges dissociates reading from intellectual activity and is situated essentially as an affective experience, as something that happens to a body and modifies a body. Modern literature, and this is the symbolic register now, is charged with the task of convincing and educating by exemplifying virtues and benefits of citizenship, while portraying the modern state as inevitable destiny of all history. Literature is pedagogy since Schiller. But literature then is also marked by aporia. If its interpolative message, for message always interpolate, is to be perceived as truly democratic, literature must address itself to the people in its totality and not just erudite subset of society. As Patrick Dove suggests, if it is to avoid charges of elitism and paternalism, it must appeal to both sensibility and reason of plebs. However, the popular subject, sensibility of reason, to which literature must appeal, cannot in all rigor said to exist before the successful transmission of the aesthetic message that literature is charged with disseminating. Literature grounds and ungrounds. The people itself is an invention of literature, as Jacques Rancière would say. However, and this is the confusion today, if the message will be deciphered, it must be interpreted and not read, for interpretation and reading are not one and the same. Where interpretation seeks meaning and message, reading and text open itself to the either disclosure of some fundamental truth claim or error, all errors are unconscious, mistakes are conscious, or insight in work. Blindness is a trait of all dramatic and tragic characters we are, hence the other and the third is necessary according to Levinas and Paul de Man. In other words, only in reading is the preparing for the event possible. And yet one can never be sure that the event has happened. Constitutive event is uncertainty and doubt. To give one example, which is no good, for no example can be good enough to illuminate the complexity, hence example itself is not singularity, reading might expose one to the other, that is other than the other, representation, misrepresentation, and the possibility of change and transformation with others, even if the other is within. Interpretation is the register or discourse of one and the same, albeit the difference, saying it should not be dismissed, I'm not arguing for that, while reading opens itself to the other, that is to the experience of her shout, her scream, her tremor, her cry, the rape and the shattering of other, to the injustice as the sign of a bodily pain that cannot be transferred to another, shared, moved, or removed. Not shared, it must be shared, marked and remarked in alter writing, for truth is suffering is ideology. This language is the language of non-communication and non-communion, in other words, what Butler calls joyful mourning and trope of testimony. This is not the whole spirit of deconstruction, but this, it should be clear, is what deconstruction and politics of alterity proposes in a nutshell, the experience of impossible and difficult transformation to the possible, as the condition of possibility for truly postmodern politics, activism, history, and sociality. And this is what Spivak and Butler are trying to do with difficult translation of alterity's demand, for the demand to be a demand it must be spoken in a shadow language, articulated, heard, written, and marked. Otherwise, there is no possibility of doing wrong. Hence, one negotiates with the state. What state? Some abstraction, one never knows, and this is the problem, and this is usually the problem that they get. However, face-to-face encounters can be tragic, for the mouth-to-ear relation is never guaranteed. One never knows to whom it is addressed, nor if one has heard well. Communication is so difficult because language, and language is material, is the bar, the division that separates, conjoins, combines, and exposes the limit, the bar that must be transgressed. For the only thing the language truly discloses is the illusion of general communication without reminders or interference. Second illusion is the illusion of mastery and possession of mother tongue or national language, understood as language of absolute departure, inheritance or heritage, in which there is nothing we can fully express and therefore translate perfectly. In other words, there is no real conversation. Conversation opens itself to the experience of sharing the incommensurable and incalculable, thus the experience of freedom, that is resistant to the appropriation of the capitalist culture of religion and its general calculation. And conversation is irreducible to communication between equals, because without eros, hence multiplicity and ecstasy, no genuine encounter with other can take place, with some sort of affective negativity, danger, risk, bafflement, illness, fear, anxiety, but also joy, happiness, and laughter, the non-discursive. All of this matters, but it might not matter at all, because translation is at the heart of the humanities, or what is left of it, and what we call the word literature, a European innovation. As Emily Acker suggests in her book Against Word Literature from 2010, translation and word literature are seen as bedfellows, where the dominant tendency is toward reflexive endorsement of cultural equivalence, substitutability, and consequently celebration of nationally and ethnically branded differences that have been mutually marketed and as commercialized identities. You will notice that the discourse used here is immersed, although is irreducible to the market as well. Equivalent, substitution, commercial on the one hand, and on the other, the dialectic of identity difference. If this is so, it is because we can agree with something that Jacques Lazare, in his new book, Untranslating Machines, a genealogy for the ends of global thought. I haven't had a chance to read it, it just came out 3 weeks ago, but I have read the introduction. Lazare writes that the weakened, defective concept of untranslatability serves to limit the articulation between generalized capitalist value system and the figure and techniques of translation. The limit to this articulation can be also found in literature. Why and how so? For Borges, translation, and especially literary translation, is no simple matter. It has a relation to the original that cannot be explained or dismissed as secondary. In 1932, Borges attests, "Ningún problema tan consustancial con las letras y con su modesto misterio el que propone una traducción." Borges argues is that the original literary writings, or direct writings in general, are marked by forgetfulness, animated by vanity, and the fear of confessing to mental processes that we encounter a chance when we translate, but also by desire to maintain central and intact an incalculable reserve for obscurity. The original is a visible text that nonetheless maintains obscurity. On the one hand, direct writings, despite their visibility, harbor a secret. On the other, translation exposes everything in that model to be imitated is a visible text, an immeasurable labyrinth of former projects, hence intertextuality, or submission to the momentary temptation of fluency. But the translation models only what is visible in the original, that is, it is predicated upon the original qua phenomenon, which means, although it appears to reveal the very heart of the matter, it in fact leaves untouched and intact the secret, the shadow, sombra, no one, void, the real, that the originally ostensibly conceals. The secret, the shadow, ghost, no one, the real, incommensurable, are markers for the untranslatable, which is not one. irreducible to mathematical identity that cannot be marketed. And yet, as David D. Johnson suggests in his 2012 book about Borges, Kant's dog, Secret also names the relation between as, philosophy, necessity, and if, literature, contingency, and chance. It names the relation between the present of the as, of sense and understanding, of truth, and the future if, of the imagination, error, and freedom that comes here and now to destroy it. The as-if names the act, the temporalization, and thus the promise of translation. And this means that as-if destroys institution, both that it grounds is, both literature and philosophy. For what escapes the market, and something always escapes, because to claim that everything is market would be an accomplished nihilism and the end of politics truly disaster, is precisely the experience of secret, the impossible possible vis-a-vis reality. The brilliance and gift of Lazarus' argument is that the original is incalculably reserved and unguarded possibility cannot be accounted for or measured in translation, because translation models itself on the original qua visible. This is why every translation is always already incomplete and infinite, and why in every translation there is an error, an impossibility, an incalculable leap, hence decision, either an opening to something else, alternative, or failure. Pierre Menard could be read along these lines, since Borges' text is about the jealous desire of a Frenchman to write not a version, not a repetition, not parody, but Don Quixote itself, the book. Derrida even jokes and makes a pun that this is irreducibly French. While Borges discloses display of desire in the original, for Don Quixote the madness emerges an escape from subjectification as the conditioned possibility for politics and his relentless struggle for justice. For what this escape and what this escape does is to point to the access or the reminder that is existential. Now, what translation cannot expose is that the fact that in one language, in the original, one moves between different languages and tongues. As Derrida suggests, translation can do everything except mark the linguistic difference inscribed in the language, the fact that there are several tongues in one language. The untranslatability of such an endeavor marks the failure of translation to become a game of social domination, where the real linguistic difference in language are converted into identity and ready to be consumed and consummated. For the untranslatability of Don Quixote, neither one nor two, hinges on the loss of reason, life without why, as a result of violence, that is, on the language of disagreement to the rules of the game. As a limit figure, Don Quixote then serves as a supplement whose desire is not easily fulfilled. For what he struggles against is precisely the libidinal investment with which modern politics endows the subject. Autonomous, self-conscious origin that assigns itself its own laws, infinity, and his or her imposition of death upon the other, the death drive. For logic or reason always strives to drag its supplement, its other, back to its own realm, to cast fields both too far outside of it, like mad love, femininity, queer touching, passion and poetry, or pure inspiration, and too close to it, like philosophy, such as phenomenology, as logic that has lost the way. The other of logic is posited as bad logic that needs to be corrected by logic. And this is logocentrism, not a discourse that rejects, defies, or displaces logic, but any that claims that the truth of domains outside of logic lies in the logic itself, as the question of humanness. None of this means to have defeated market or logos. We are in war. After all, logos is not pathology, it can be cured. It does, however, mean that resisting it, interrupting it, and showing its limits and failures of translation as politics of separation and detotalization is perhaps one of the ways. This exposition is not geared to propose a third way or third road, but to index the side of its possibility today. Language, reading, and untranslatable as markers of another that is an other to the other of multiculturalism, identity politics, and intercultural communication, that is the discourse of ideological state. According to Jacques Rancière, Karl Marx's reproduction of the relation of production, the reproduction of the master-slave schism, operates by reducing every being to a what that can be identified, to a police state in which element or member of the whole is printed and evaluated. Literature, however, is not one of those whats, but partition of sense, desire, and wanting to say as not at all. That is an aesthetic experience, not a process, not training, not pedagogy. One cannot say what literature is, for it is how it is. For in Borges is writing literature and translation, when and if they happen, the aesthetic thematizes the failure of literature to become either hegemonic or counter-hegemonic instrument or institution. Thus, for Borges, literature is neither autonomous nor sovereign, but it is simply a place somewhere. As Paul Deman and many others have taught us, literature, as well as women, might be the only two something in the world that do not have an essence and where nothing is equivalent. Rather than reaffirming old modern notions of aesthetic value and the best perfect self, which would only reproduce the ground of nihilism that it seeks to overcome, Borges invites us to think the aesthetic as an intervention of heteronomy without obedience, as an interruption both of absolute translation and the totalizing claims of modern state in its various forms. For impossibility of distinction between literature as intervention from literature as conservation or literature as seduction would spell the absolute death of literature. At the end, instead of opening numerous questions, let me leave you with two passages from Brett Levinson that I think that are very useful. The first one goes like this. The limit of communication and translation is the condition of possibility of transgression and freedom. For any engagement with or refusal of limits to power, there is no such crossing, trespassing, no liberation break, but solely the resentment of the will of the boundless and ideal I, yo, eu, the performance of the individual or collective, it makes no difference. And the second one. Absolute conquest is not translation of the other into the same, but of translation itself into single common sense. Conquest, in other words, is the end of translation or absolute translation. The other's recognition of the mastery of reason and of the Europe itself mastery of reason is gained when the other is not like or unlike, but is the same. When the communication of reason to the other arrives immediately, and this is the dream of market immediacy, without interference, disturbance, intervention, or time of translation, when the two are one, and are so without any persuasion. End of quote. What the man's thinking is to figure the third way of becoming and wrote third step as a different way of non-violent writing and translation. This work is yet to be thought through and done, for the change of world that is always already there, and heterogeneity is threatened today by the death machine of identity politics and multiculturalism. And so what we need, I think, is a new mode of sight that would open up to the incalculable leap to the unknown. Thank you.